Story 1. The Haunting of Hollow Manor, a full story. Part 1, The Arrival. Emma had always been captivated by the strange and unexplained, her career as a journalist driven by a need to uncover the darkest secrets buried in the corners of forgotten places. So, when a letter arrived in the mail informing her she'd inherited Hollow Manor, a decaying, Gothic mansion surrounded by fog-drenched woods from a distant relative she'd never met, she took it as a sign. Her curiosity overpowered the warning signs, and she packed her bags, prepared to spend a few days there, documenting her experiences for an article. The village closest to Hollow Manor was quaint, with stone-paved streets and crooked houses. When she stopped by a small cafe to ask for directions, a strange hush fell over the room. The patrons, all locals, stared at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "You don't want to be going up there, miss," the barista said in a hushed tone, her eyes darting nervously to the other patrons as if even speaking about Hollow Manor might bring trouble. Emma forced a polite smile, dismissing the warning. "It's just for a few days. I'm a journalist, researching local history." "History isn't all you'll find there," an old man in the corner muttered, his voice barely audible over the sudden gust of wind rattling the windows. She thanked them, feeling the weight of their stares as she left the cafe. Her curiosity piqued, Emma made her way up the winding road toward Hollow Manor, watching as the fog thickened and swallowed the trees around her. The closer she got, the more unsettling the surroundings became. Towering trees loomed like skeletal giants, and a damp, suffocating silence hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint rustle of unseen creatures in the woods. At last, Hollow Manor appeared before her. It stood as a dark, twisted shadow against the evening sky, with ivy crawling up its crumbling walls and broken, shuttered windows like vacant eyes. The house seemed to exhale a silent, heavy presence that settled around her like a damp shroud. She felt a chill skitter up her spine, but brushed it off, reminding herself that she was here to work. As she unlocked the massive oak doors and stepped inside, the silence grew oppressive. The foyer was grand yet decayed, with peeling wallpaper and a grand staircase that led up into shadows. A faint, musty smell filled the air, as if the house itself was trying to inhale every bit of fresh air she brought in with her. She set her bags down, took out her notebook, and began jotting down her first impressions. The manor was silent, save for the occasional creak and groan as if the very walls were stretching awake, sensing her arrival. "Just a house," she whispered to herself. "Just another old, empty house." Part 2, The Discovery. That night, as Emma explored the manor, she stumbled upon a dusty, forgotten library filled with books coated in cobwebs and grime. She ran her finger along the shelves, amused at the layer of dust that had likely been untouched for decades. In a far corner, half hidden behind a stack of brittle old papers, she found a small, black leather-bound diary. The name Eliza was scrawled in delicate handwriting across the cover, faded and nearly illegible. Intrigued, Emma opened the diary, the pages cracking as she flipped them. It appeared to belong to a girl who had lived in the house over a century ago. Eliza's entries were simple at first, recounting daily activities and the names of family members. But as she read on, the tone shifted. Eliza wrote about strange occurrences, the sound of footsteps in the night, whispers that seemed to float through the walls, and glimpses of a dark figure she called the Shadow Man. Emma chuckled nervously, thinking it was a figment of a lonely child's imagination. But the more she read, the more disturbing the entries became. "Once you see him," Eliza had written in her final entry, "he never leaves. His shadow grows closer each night." Emma set the diary down, unnerved, yet unwilling to let a child's tale of a dark figure shake her resolve. She glanced around the room, feeling the shadows deepen and press in on her, but forced herself to keep exploring. After all, she was here to uncover mysteries, not run from them. Part 3, The First Night. After her initial exploration, Emma settled into one of the guest rooms, the only one that didn't reek of mold. She wrapped herself in blankets, listening to the wind howl outside and the wood creak as the house settled into the night. But sleep wouldn't come. It started with a faint sound, the creak of footsteps echoing down the hall. Emma's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, listening, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, moving slowly, methodically, as if someone, or something, was making its way closer to her door. Emma sat up, gripping the edge of the blanket, her rational mind fighting the instinct to run. She reminded herself that it was an old house, prone to strange sounds. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. She exhaled, laughing at her paranoia, and turned back toward the bed. A loud crack shattered the quiet, the sound echoing through the room. She whipped around, her eyes landing on the mirror on the far wall, which had split right down the center, its jagged edges catching the light in strange, distorted angles. Her pulse quickened. Mirrors didn't just break on their own. She moved closer, looking for some sign of what could have caused it, but found nothing. Something cold and invisible brushed against her shoulder, making her flinch. But when she turned around, the room was empty, bathed in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. She tried to shake off the creeping dread that was tightening around her chest and returned to bed, pulling the covers tightly around herself. Just a coincidence, she whispered, forcing her eyes closed. Just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew there was something more, something waiting in the shadows. Part 4, The Stranger in the Window. The following day, Emma tried to push away the previous night's events, dismissing them as a mixture of exhaustion and nerves. She wandered through the mansion, documenting her findings, snapping photographs, and making notes. She even returned to the village to interview a few locals about the history of the manor, but most refused to talk. Those who did only mentioned it in hushed tones, speaking of disappearances, curses, and whispers in the dark. Back at the manor, she was reviewing her notes by a downstairs window when she felt the hairs on her arms prickle. She glanced up and froze. In the upstairs window, directly above her, stood a figure. The figure was hazy, almost transparent, with indistinct features. But even from this distance, she could make out hollow eyes and a twisted smile, staring directly at her. Emma blinked, her heart racing. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her staring at her own reflection in the glass, her pale face mirroring her shock. She stumbled back, trying to rationalize it, trying to believe it had been nothing more than a reflection or trick of the light. But a part of her knew better. She had seen him, the Shadow Man. Part 5, The Voices. That night, the house felt even colder than before, and the darkness seemed thicker, clinging to her skin like a wet blanket. As she lay in bed, trying to will herself to sleep, she heard it again, whispers, faint and indistinct, seeping through the walls like an insidious breeze. She sat up, straining to catch the words, but they slipped away just as she focused on them. The voices seemed to beckon her, calling her name, luring her deeper into the house. Against her better judgment, she left her room, her footsteps echoing down the empty halls as she followed the whispers. They led her to the basement, a cold, damp place she'd only briefly explored before. But tonight, it felt different, as if something was waiting for her. On the floorboards, scratched in rough, jagged letters, were the words, "Don't go into the woods." She backed away, heart racing, but her gaze was drawn to the corner of the basement, where shadows seemed to gather and twist, forming a figure, a tall, dark shape with hollow eyes. The Shadow Man. She stumbled back, her mind racing, but when she blinked, he was gone. Emma ran up the stairs, her heart pounding as she locked herself in her room, feeling the walls close in around her. She knew now that the stories were true. Hollow Manor was cursed, and the Shadow Man would not rest until he claimed her. Part 6, The Final Stand. Emma spent the following day in a state of numb fear, avoiding mirrors and windows, hearing the whispers grow louder, as if the walls themselves were chanting her name. She knew she couldn't stay, yet something deep within her told her that leaving would be impossible. The Shadow Man had marked her, bound her to the house, and he would not let her go. On her final night, Emma saw Eliza's ghost standing at the foot of her bed, a pale, sorrowful figure with eyes that pleaded for release. But before Emma could reach out, the Shadow Man appeared, his hollow eyes fixed on her, his mouth twisted into a mocking grin. In her final moments, Emma scribbled her last entry in her journal, her hand shaking as she wrote, "If you're reading this, don't make my mistake. Don't let him in." The police found her journal, her empty body, and the cracked mirror the next morning. Hollow Manor remains uninhabited to this day, a cursed, shadowed relic of a darker past. And those who pass by at night swear they can still hear the whispers, calling for the next soul to claim. The Haunting of Hollow Manor, a full story, Part 2. Part 2, The Discovery. After a restless first night, Emma woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the thick, heavy curtains of her room in Hollow Manor. Determined to brush off the strange events of the night before, the footsteps, the cracked mirror, she resolved to explore more of the house. She wanted to find something concrete, something tangible that would explain the eerie atmosphere and the ominous tales whispered by the villagers. After breakfast, she climbed the winding staircase to the attic, where she expected to find a wealth of forgotten artifacts left behind by the house's previous occupants. The attic was a large, dimly lit room with slanted ceilings, dusty beams, and only a single, narrow window that cast a faint glow over piles of boxes and stacks of old furniture covered in sheets. The air was thick with the smell of mold and stale paper. As she waded through the clutter, she noticed a small, unmarked box half buried beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Intrigued, she pulled it free, brushing off the dust to reveal a sturdy wooden box with a rusty clasp. When she pried it open, a plume of dust rose, filling the room with an ancient, musty smell. Inside, she found a stack of yellowing papers and a small, leather-bound diary. She carefully lifted the diary out of the box, noting the faint, delicate handwriting on the cover, Eliza. Emma flipped open the diary, instantly captivated by the old-fashioned script. As she read the first few entries, she realized it belonged to a young girl who had lived in the manor over a century ago. The entry started innocently enough, describing day-to-day life, the names of family members, and small, playful details of the house's nooks and crannies. But as she read further, Emma noticed a shift in tone. Eliza's entries grew more anxious, describing strange occurrences she couldn't explain. She wrote of hearing footsteps at night, despite being certain her family was asleep. She described cold drafts and shadows that seemed to follow her, even when she was alone. One entry caught Emma's eye. The date was smudged, but the text was chillingly clear. "There's someone in the house, though Mother and Father don't believe me. He's tall and dark, and he hides in the shadows. I've seen him watching me, always from a distance. But each night, he comes closer. I call him the Shadow Man. He only appears when the house is quiet, when the darkness feels thick and heavy. Once you see him, he never leaves." Emma's fingers tightened around the diary. The details echoed what she'd experienced in her brief time in the house, the oppressive atmosphere, the feeling of being watched, the faint sound of footsteps in the night. But she shook her head, trying to reason it away. "It's just the overactive imagination of a young girl," she thought, "someone lonely in a big house with too much time to dwell on things that go bump in the night." Yet as she continued reading, Eliza's entries became increasingly fearful. The girl wrote of hearing whispers coming from empty rooms, seeing glimpses of the Shadow Man's hollow eyes in darkened corners, and feeling cold hands brush against her skin when she was alone. Eliza's fear was palpable, seeping off the pages as if it had been trapped within them, growing more potent over the decades. One of the final entries read, "Mother says I'm imagining it, but I know he's real. I see him every night, coming closer and closer. His face is hollow, empty, as if he's nothing more than a shadow wearing the shape of a man. I tried to tell Father, but he just laughed, told me it was time I grew up. I don't know if anyone else can see him, but I know he's here. And he wants me." Emma closed the diary, a chill creeping up her spine. Despite her efforts to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The way Eliza described the Shadow Man felt all too real, too vivid to be the mere imaginings of a child. Part 3, Signs of the Shadow Man. Determined to finish her exploration despite her rising unease, Emma continued digging through the attic, hoping to find more clues about Eliza and her family. She sifted through stacks of old letters, family portraits with faded faces, and brittle, handwritten notes that crumbled at her touch. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her work, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, pressing in on her like an unseen weight. She pulled out her camera, snapping a few photos of the attic to document her findings. As she reviewed the images on the camera screen, her breath caught. In the far corner of one photo, half hidden in the shadows, she saw a dark, humanoid figure. Her heart pounded as she stared at the figure, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light or a flaw in the camera. But when she looked up, the attic was empty, save for her and the dust-covered relics. She shivered, putting the camera away quickly. The silence in the attic was thick and unnatural, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. Part 4, A Chilling Encounter. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Eliza's diary, about the terror that seemed to seep through the girl's words. She tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the curtains kept her on edge. She lay there, wide awake, her mind replaying the diary entries over and over. Then, just as she began to drift into an uneasy sleep, she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound outside her bedroom door. Her eyes snapped open, and she held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer with each step, stopping just outside her door. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until finally, she heard the faintest whisper, like a voice trying to claw its way through the wall. "Eliza!" Emma's blood ran cold. She sat up, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. She stared at the door, her body frozen with fear, her mind racing. "It's just the wind," she told herself, clinging to any explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. But deep down, she knew better. Gathering every ounce of courage, she rose from the bed, gripping the heavy candlestick on her nightstand as a makeshift weapon. She approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. With a deep breath, she flung the door open, ready to confront whatever was waiting on the other side. The hallway was empty, shrouded in darkness. But as she stood there, her heart pounding, she caught a faint movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping around the corner at the far end of the hallway. A shadow shaped like a man. Part 5, The Mirror's Reflection. Emma's fear reached a boiling point the following day. She decided to call a friend, thinking she could get someone to stay with her, if only for a night. But when she picked up her phone, she found it dead, despite having charged it the night before. Frustrated and unnerved, she left it on the counter and returned to her exploration, hoping to distract herself. In one of the upstairs bathrooms, she found a large, cracked mirror above an old sink. The mirror had seen better days, with jagged lines spiderwebbing across its surface and a thick layer of grime obscuring the reflection. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a movement in the mirror, faint but unmistakable. She froze, staring at the mirror. Her own reflection stared back, but behind her, just over her shoulder, stood a dark figure. He was tall and indistinct, with hollow eyes that bore into her, a faint, twisted smile etched into the shadowy outline of his face. Emma whipped around, but there was no one there. Her skin prickled with cold, and she felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the figure was still there, watching her, even though she couldn't see him. She stumbled out of the bathroom, her pulse racing, and fled down the stairs, determined to leave the house. But as she reached the front door, she found it locked, the heavy, ancient latch refusing to budge. Her panic grew, and she tried every window, every other door, but each one was sealed tight, as if the house itself were conspiring to keep her inside. Part 6, The Final Revelation. In her desperation, Emma returned to the attic, searching for any clue, any hint that could explain the house's hold on her. She opened Eliza's diary one last time, hoping for answers. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, read, "The shadow man won't let me leave. He's everywhere, watching, waiting. I can't escape him. If you're reading this, he's marked you too. There's no escape once you're in his sight. He follows, closer each night." As she read those words, the shadows in the attic seemed to grow, pooling around her feet and stretching across the floor. She looked up, her breath hitching as she saw him, the shadow man, standing in the corner, his hollow eyes locked onto her, a twisted, predatory smile on his face. Emma backed away, but he followed. The Haunting of Hollow Manor, a full story, Part 3. Part 3, the first night. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the decrepit walls of Hollow Manor. Emma prepared for her first night alone in the mansion, a mix of excitement and trepidation swirling in her gut. She had spent the day exploring, documenting every creak and groan of the old house, but as the darkness settled in, an unsettling atmosphere enveloped her. The heavy wooden door to her room creaked open, and she stepped inside, the chill of the evening air sending a shiver down her spine. She decided to distract herself with a book she had found in the attic, one of the many relics the house held within its decaying walls. She settled into bed, the old mattress sinking beneath her weight, and tried to immerse herself in the story. But the words blurred as her eyes grew heavy, sleep tugging at her like a comforting embrace. Just as she began to drift off, a sound broke the silence, a soft thump, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside her room. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, shuffling as if someone were pacing back and forth outside her door. She blinked in the darkness, waiting for the sound to stop, hoping it was merely her imagination or the house settling. But the footsteps continued, each step resonating like a distant drumbeat in her ears. Emma swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cool floorboards sending a shock through her. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to stay put. But curiosity and a burgeoning sense of dread propelled her forward. Gathering her courage, she tiptoed to the door, placing her hand on the cold knob. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence behind them. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding loudly in her chest. She opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. The corridor stretched before her, empty and shadowy, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The air felt thick, as if it were saturated with unspoken fears. She called out softly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice echoed back, mocking her loneliness. She took a tentative step forward, straining to hear anything that might explain the footsteps. But the silence was all-consuming, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Just as she was about to retreat back to her room, she heard a sound, a sharp crack, followed by the deafening shatter of glass. Emma jumped, her heart racing as she turned to see a mirror on the wall across the hall had cracked, the jagged lines spreading across its surface like a web. The sound reverberated in the stillness, echoing in her ears as she stepped closer, cautiously examining the broken mirror. The moonlight glinted off the shattered pieces, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a figure moving behind her reflection, something dark, something sinister. Emma whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the empty hallway, which now seemed even darker, more foreboding than before. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the panic rising within her. "It's just an old house," she told herself. "Mirrors break. It's just a coincidence." But the cold shiver that traveled down her spine told a different story. She could feel it, that creeping sensation of being watched, as if the shadows themselves were alive and breathing, lurking just beyond her line of sight. Part 4, A Sleep Disturbed. Returning to her room, Emma tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. She climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around herself as if they could shield her from whatever haunted the house. She turned off the lamp and stared at the ceiling, willing herself to relax, but sleep would not come. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind made her heart race, and she found herself replaying the events of the night. Minutes turned into hours, and just as she thought she might finally drift off, she heard it again, the footsteps, echoing in the hallway, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to be coming closer, each footfall growing louder, a steady rhythm that resonated through the walls. Emma sat up, her breath hitching in her throat. She gripped the blankets tightly, listening intently, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The sound stopped outside her door, lingering there, waiting. "Hello?" she called again, her voice shaking. No answer came, only silence. She strained her ears, desperate for any sign of life, but there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the old house pressing in on her. Summoning her courage, Emma swung her legs over the side of the bed once more, determined to confront whatever was lurking just outside her door. She felt like a child again, scared of the dark but too curious to stay hidden. With a deep breath, she crept toward the door, her heart racing as she reached for the knob. Just as she was about to turn it, she heard a soft whisper, barely audible, brushing against her ear. "Eliza." Emma froze, the name echoing in her mind, the hair on her arms standing on end. Who is Eliza? She wondered, suddenly aware that the name was tied to the diary she had read earlier. The whispers grew louder, circling around her, and she felt a surge of dread wash over her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice breaking. The whispers ceased, plunging her back into silence. Gathering her resolve, she turned the knob and flung open the door, half expecting to find the hallway empty once more. Instead, she was met with a dark, swirling mist that hung low to the ground, obscuring the floor and creeping into the corners of the hallway like a living thing. It twisted and turned, shifting in the air as if it were reaching for her. Panic surged through her, and she took a step back, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. She leaned against it, her heart racing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The darkness outside her door felt alive, waiting, watching. Part 5, Confronting the Unknown. Unable to stay in her room, Emma paced the small space, trying to come up with a plan. "I need to get out of here," she thought desperately. But how? She glanced toward the window, remembering the villagers' warnings about the house. But deep down, she knew she had to confront the unknown. Whatever was haunting Hollow Manor, it had already made its presence known, and running wouldn't change that. With renewed determination, Emma walked back to the door, heart pounding as she unlocked it and swung it open. The hallway was still shrouded in darkness, the mist swirling ominously at her feet, but she felt a strange compulsion to step forward, to unravel the mystery that lay before her. She reached the end of the hallway, where a narrow staircase spiraled down into the depths of the house. With every step, she could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around her, the air growing colder as she descended. The ground floor felt different, more oppressive. She stepped into the parlor, its dusty furniture and cobweb-laden corners echoing the echoes of a life long forgotten. The fireplace stood cold and empty, but her attention was drawn to the mirror that hung above it, a large, ornate piece that glinted dully in the low light. Emma approached the mirror cautiously, remembering the crack she had witnessed earlier. As she stood before it, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the darkness that surrounded her. As she gazed into the glass, her reflection wavered and distorted, the image shifting as though it were alive. Just as she leaned in closer, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Behind her, the dark figure of the shadow man stood, his hollow eyes boring into her. Emma gasped, spinning around, but there was nothing. Just the empty parlor, cloaked in shadows. She turned back to the mirror, heart racing. The shadow man was still there, lurking just behind her reflection, a dark shape against the glass, his presence chilling and oppressive. She felt as if he were drawing closer, his emptiness pulling at her very soul. "You're not real," she whispered, desperation clawing at her throat. But the figure merely smiled, the twisted grin stretching wider, as if he found her fear amusing. Emma stumbled back, the mirror reflecting her terror in grotesque detail. Part 6, Descent into Madness. Feeling overwhelmed, Emma fled from the parlor and into the main hallway, her breath coming in short gasps. She had to escape, had to find a way out of this house of horrors. She ran to the front door, but when she reached for the knob, it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at her throat as she pulled and shoved, but it remained firmly locked, trapping her inside. Turning back, she felt the shadows close in around her, the darkness pressing against her as if it were alive, wrapping around her limbs. She stumbled into the nearest room, a dusty sitting room filled with faded furniture and heavy drapes. The air felt heavy, thick with despair, and she could hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, calling her name. "Emma." It was as if the house was trying to draw her deeper into its web of darkness. She shook her head, backing away, trying to distance herself from the suffocating atmosphere. But as she turned to leave, she saw him again, the Shadow Man, standing in the doorway, blocking her escape. His eyes gleamed with a hollow light, and the smile on his face twisted into something more sinister, more hungry. "Why do you run?" his voice echoed, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the house. Emma's heart raced as she turned to run, but he moved with unnatural speed, stepping in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. She felt the cold tendrils of fear wrapping around her, pulling her toward him. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with malice. "You belong to me now." As she stumbled backward, she caught sight of the cracked mirror again, its surface reflecting the chaos of the moment. The image was distorted, twisted, revealing a world that felt both familiar and terrifyingly alien. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, merging with the echoes of Eliza's frantic entries. She could feel herself slipping away, her sense of self unraveling in the presence of the Shadow Man. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma turned and ran, breaking free from the room and bolting up the stairs. She dashed through the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers pursued her, the shadows creeping closer with each desperate step. Part 7, A Glimpse of the Past. Breathless and frantic, Emma reached the attic once more, her refuge from the horrors lurking in the rest of the house. She threw herself through the door and slammed it shut, leaning against it to catch her breath. As she scanned the dimly lit room, her gaze fell upon the box she had discovered earlier, the one filled with Eliza's diary and the strange papers. In her fear-driven frenzy, she realized that she hadn't fully examined the other contents of the box. Desperate for answers, she rushed to it and opened it, pulling out the yellowing papers. They were more diary entries, but this time they contained letters, correspondence between Eliza and her family. The tone shifted from innocent childhood musings to urgent pleas for help, echoing her own situation. One letter caught her eye. "Dear Mother, I can hear him at night. The Shadow Man watches me, and I am afraid. He says I am his, that I cannot escape. Please, do not dismiss my fears. I am begging you." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she read the haunting words. She felt a deep connection to Eliza, realizing that the girl's fate might mirror her own. As the shadows swirled around her, she came across one final piece of paper, a drawing of a dark figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Beneath it, Eliza had written in shaky letters, "He wants my soul." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the drawing. The resemblance to the Shadow Man was undeniable. The whispers intensified, and she felt the walls of the attic closing in. The Shadow Man was coming, and she could no longer deny the truth. Whatever had claimed Eliza had now set its sights on her. Part 8, The Final Stand. With renewed determination, Emma realized she had to confront the Shadow Man once and for all. The attic felt like her last chance, a sanctuary that held the remnants of Eliza's spirit. She turned to the mirror in the corner, its cracked surface reflecting the flickering candlelight. Gathering her strength, Emma stood before it and spoke loudly, her voice echoing in the silence. "You will not take me. I am not afraid of you." The shadows writhed in response, twisting and contorting as if in anger. The cold air in the attic thickened, pressing against her like a physical force. But she stood her ground, heart racing yet defiant. "You cannot have my soul," she shouted, feeling the words reverberate through her. The Shadow Man appeared, stepping out from the darkness with an almost serpentine grace. His form flickered in and out of the shadows, eyes glinting with malicious hunger. "You belong to me, Emma," he hissed, his voice a seductive whisper that sent chills down her spine. "Just like Eliza before you." "No!" Emma screamed, stepping closer to the mirror, the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. "I am not Eliza. I won't let you take me." In that moment, a surge of energy flooded through her, fueled by the desperation of the girl who had once lived in this house. The mirror's surface shimmered, reflecting a brightness that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. Emma reached out, pressing her palm against the glass. "Be gone," she cried, pouring every ounce of her will into the mirror. The shadow man recoiled, his form wavering as the light grew stronger, illuminating the attic with a blinding radiance. "No! You cannot escape me," he screamed, his voice rising to a shriek of rage. But Emma stood firm, her resolve unwavering as the light enveloped her. The mirror pulsed with energy, a barrier between her and the shadows. With one final push, she yelled, "I am free!" The darkness screamed, a cacophony of rage and despair, as the light surged forward, consuming the shadow man. The attic trembled around her, the walls vibrating with power as the shadows began to dissipate, retreating into the corners of the room. Part 9, Dawn's Light. When the light finally subsided, Emma found herself alone in the attic, the shadows banished and the air clear. The mirror had returned to its cracked state, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced with a serene stillness. Exhausted yet triumphant, Emma sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, breaking the cycle that had trapped Eliza and countless others in Hollow Manor. As dawn broke, light flooded into the attic through the grimy windows, bathing the room in warmth. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the house lift from her shoulders. She knew that while the remnants of the past would always linger, she had reclaimed her freedom. With one last look at the attic, she gathered the diary and the other papers, clutching them to her chest. She would share Eliza's story, making sure the girl's voice was not forgotten, that the legacy of Hollow Manor would not claim another soul. Emma descended the stairs for the final time, opening the front door with newfound determination. The sun illuminated the path ahead, guiding her away from the haunted past and into a brighter future. As she stepped out into the light, she felt a gentle breeze brush against her cheek, a whisper of gratitude from the house she had freed. Hollow Manor, once a prison of shadows, stood silent behind her, a testament to the power of courage and resilience in the face of darkness. And though the stories would continue to swirl among the villagers, Emma knew the truth. She had broken the curse, and the whispers of Hollow Manor would finally rest. The Haunting of Hollow Manor, a full story, Part 4. Part 4, The Stranger in the Window. The next morning dawned dreary and overcast, thick clouds hanging low in the sky like a heavy shroud. Emma awoke with a sense of unease settling over her, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. The echoes of the whispers lingered in her thoughts, and the memory of the shadow man haunted her dreams. She resolved to push through her fears, determined to explore the manor further and uncover its secrets. After a quick breakfast, she decided to investigate the upstairs rooms. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten corners and creaking floorboards, each step stirring up dust motes that danced in the dim light. As she climbed the grand staircase, a chill ran down her spine. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and lingering memories. Emma paused in front of one of the windows, its glass clouded with age, and looked out over the sprawling grounds. The gardens were wild and unkempt, overgrown with weeds and brambles that seemed to claw at the earth. As she peered into the distance, something caught her eye. There, in one of the upstairs windows, stood a figure. At first, she thought it was her imagination playing tricks on her, perhaps a reflection of herself or an odd play of light through the old glass. But as she squinted, she could see it more clearly, a shadowy, indistinct figure, its features blurred and undefined, standing motionless in the window. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but curiosity won over caution. She needed to see this for herself. Emma hurried down the staircase, her heart racing as she stepped outside the manor. The damp air clung to her skin, the eerie quiet of the estate pressing in around her. As she walked closer to the house, she found herself drawn to the window where she had seen the figure. It loomed above her, an ominous presence against the backdrop of the overcast sky. Emma squinted, her eyes straining to see inside. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing back in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. Just the haunting silence of Hollow Manor, and the feeling that she was not alone. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back from the house and looked up at the window again. The figure was still there, staring down at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Emma blinked, her heart racing as she waited for the shadow to move. But when she opened her eyes, it had vanished, leaving only the empty window behind. "What the hell?" Emma whispered, shaking her head as if to clear the fog of disbelief that clouded her mind. She felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Was it a figment of her imagination? A trick of the light? Determined to uncover the truth, Emma walked around to the front entrance of the manor, scanning the windows as she went. Each one seemed to hold secrets, shadows lingering just out of reach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to uncover its mystery. As she rounded the corner of the house, she spotted the entrance to the cellar, an old wooden door barely visible beneath a tangle of ivy and vines. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her to explore the depths of the manor's past. A chill ran down her spine as she stood before it, a mix of dread and intrigue flooding her senses. "Why not?" she muttered to herself, the weight of the house's history pressing heavily on her. "What's the worst that could happen?" Part 5, Into the Cellar. The door creaked open, revealing a dark stairway that spiraled down into the depths of the cellar. The air was damp and musty, and the faint smell of mildew wafted up to greet her. Emma hesitated for a moment, her heart racing as she peered into the darkness. The soft whispers seemed to beckon her closer, a siren call she couldn't resist. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The darkness enveloped her, and she fumbled for her phone, using its light to guide her. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing cobwebs clinging to the walls and piles of forgotten debris scattered across the floor. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stepped into a large room, its walls lined with old shelves filled with dusty bottles and forgotten relics. The atmosphere felt thick with secrets, and she could almost hear the echoes of laughter and sorrow from the past. In one corner of the cellar, she spotted an old trunk, its hinges rusted and the leather weathered with age. Her heart raced as she approached it, the sense of anticipation building within her. What could it hold? More of Eliza's secrets? Emma knelt beside the trunk, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. It creaked open, revealing a trove of old clothes, yellowing letters, and a small, ornate box. She reached for the box first, its surface adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with energy. As she opened it, a gust of cold air rushed past her, extinguishing her phone's light. Darkness engulfed her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. "Emma," the whisper echoed through the cellar, sending chills down her spine. She fumbled for her phone, trying to turn it back on, but it flickered and died, plunging her into complete darkness. "Who's there?" she shouted, fear lacing her voice. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own rapid heartbeat. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her, a shadow moving in the darkness. Emma whipped around, her breath caught in her throat, but saw nothing. The whispers swirled around her, growing louder, more insistent. "Leave this place," they hissed. "He's watching." Emma's pulse quickened, the warning igniting a primal urge to escape. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she stumbled toward the stairs. But as she turned to flee, the cellar door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, trapping her inside. Part 6, Trapped in Darkness. "Let me out!" Emma shouted, pounding on the door, panic rising within her. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. She could feel the whispers intensifying, merging into a cacophony of voices, each one laced with fear and despair. "Emma, help us! Leave now, before it's too late! Run!" Desperation clawed at her as she turned back toward the room, searching for any other exit. The shelves loomed around her, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to shift and sway in the darkness. She could feel the chill creeping closer, as if the shadows themselves were reaching for her. "Stay away from me," she yelled, her voice echoing in the confined space. But the whispers only grew louder, drowning out her cries. Suddenly, a flicker of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the room for a brief moment. Emma squinted, catching sight of a figure standing at the far end of the cellar, indistinct and shadowy, yet undeniably human. "Help!" she cried, rushing toward the figure. Please, let me out. But as she drew closer, the light flickered again, and the figure transformed into the Shadow Man, his hollow eyes gleaming with malice, a twisted grin stretching across his face. You should have never come here, he hissed, his voice dripping with malevolence. You belong to me now. Emma froze, terror coursing through her veins. She turned to run back toward the door, but the shadows closed in around her, twisting and writhing as they blocked her escape. She felt the icy fingers of despair gripping her heart, the realization dawning that she was trapped. No, she screamed, desperate to break free. I won't let you take me. Summoning every ounce of strength, Emma lunged for the trunk she had opened earlier. She needed something, anything, that could help her escape the clutches of the Shadow Man. Rummaging through the contents, she came across Eliza's letters, their fragile pages barely holding together. As she clutched them tightly, the whispers morphed into a singular voice, Eliza's voice, filled with sorrow and determination. You must remember me, you can break the curse. Emma's heart raced as she held the letters close, the weight of Eliza's words igniting a spark of hope within her. She recalled the final entry in the diary, the one that warned of the Shadow Man's power, and how he thrived on fear and despair. You are stronger than he knows. Eliza's voice urged. Face him, Emma. Do not let him take you. With renewed resolve, Emma stood tall, her eyes narrowing at the Shadow Man as he advanced toward her. I refuse to be a pawn in your game, she shouted, her voice ringing with defiance. The shadows recoiled as she stepped forward, the light from the trunk illuminating her path. Emma raised the letters high, the words spilling out like a protective barrier, fueled by her determination and the spirit of Eliza. I will not let you take me, she cried, her voice cutting through the darkness. I am not afraid. The Shadow Man hesitated, the twisted grin faltering as he felt the power of her resolve. For a brief moment, the shadows around him flickered, and Emma seized the opportunity. She rushed toward the door, her heart pounding as she pressed against it, willing it to open. The door creaked under her pressure, and with a final push, it swung open, spilling light into the dark cellar. Emma stumbled forward, the warmth wrapping around her like a protective cocoon as she escaped the clutches of the Shadow Man. Part 7, A Narrow Escape. Emma raced up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she burst out into the daylight. The fresh air felt like a lifeline, invigorating her as she stumbled onto the front porch. She turned back to the manor, heart pounding in her chest, ready to face whatever darkness still lingered within. But the house stood silent, the shadows retreating into the corners, the whispers fading into the wind. She had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious, but the battle was far from over. As she caught her breath, she knew she had to find a way to end the curse that bound Eliza and countless others to Hollow Manor. The letters in her hands felt heavy with the weight of their stories, and Emma resolved to uncover the truth, to give a voice to those who had been silenced. With newfound determination, she made her way back inside, ready to face whatever awaited her in the heart of the mansion. The walls seemed to pulse with anticipation, the remnants of Eliza's spirit guiding her steps as she ventured deeper into the unknown. Part 8, Revealing the Truth. Emma navigated the darkened hallways, her mind racing with thoughts of Eliza and the secrets that still lay hidden within the house. The letters felt like a lifeline, connecting her to the girl who had once lived there, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was still watching over her. She made her way back to the attic, the place where it all began. As she entered, she felt a shift in the air, a whisper of something ancient and powerful. The diary and the letters were still spread out on the floor, waiting for her to piece together the puzzle. Emma knelt down, carefully spreading out the letters, her fingers trembling as she examined each one. The stories unfolded like a tapestry of sorrow and fear, detailing Eliza's descent into despair as the Shadow Man tightened his grip. Help me find peace, she whispered, feeling the weight of the past settle on her shoulders. I will make this right. As she read through Eliza's words, one letter stood out, more urgent than the rest. It spoke of a ritual, an ancient practice that could sever the bond between the Shadow Man and his victims. But the details were vague, shrouded in fear and desperation. Emma knew she had to perform the ritual, to confront the Shadow Man once more and reclaim Eliza's spirit. The thought filled her with dread, but she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far. Gathering her courage, Emma scoured the attic for anything that could help her, a candle, a bowl, something to focus her energy. She found an old bowl tucked away in the corner, its surface cracked but sturdy. She filled it with water from a nearby window, the moonlight shining through and casting eerie shadows across the room. With the bowl in place, she arranged the letters around it, creating a makeshift altar. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the energy in the room shift as she prepared to summon the spirit of Eliza. "Please, Eliza," she called, her voice steady despite the trembling in her heart. "I need your strength. Help me break this curse." The air grew thick with tension as she closed her eyes, channeling her thoughts into the ritual. The shadows flickered, the whispers returning, but this time they felt different, more like a chorus of support than despair. As she spoke the words she had pieced together from the letters, the room filled with an otherworldly light. The shadows swirled around her, reacting to her determination and the call of Eliza's spirit. "Come to me, Eliza!" Emma cried, the power of her voice resonating through the attic. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure that shimmered with ethereal light. Emma's heart raced as she recognized the familiar shape of Eliza, her face both serene and sorrowful. "Emma," Eliza's voice floated through the air, soft yet powerful. "You have come for me." "I have come to help you," Emma replied, tears streaming down her face. "I will not let him take you anymore." With renewed strength, Emma continued the ritual, pouring her heart into the words as Eliza's spirit hovered before her. The shadows writhed, pushing back against the darkness as the power of their connection grew. "Together, we can break the curse," Emma shouted, feeling the energy surge through her. "You are not alone." The shadows screamed, the voice of the Shadow Man echoing in the chaos. "You cannot stop me. She is mine." But Emma stood firm, refusing to back down. She reached out, extending her hand toward Eliza. "We will fight together." In that moment, the bond between them ignited, a surge of light erupting from the altar. The room was flooded with brilliance, illuminating the attic and banishing the shadows that had haunted Hollow Manor for centuries. The Shadow Man writhed in pain, his form flickering and twisting as the light pushed him back. "No! You cannot take her from me," he screamed, desperation lacing his voice. But Emma and Eliza were united, their wills intertwined as they stood against the darkness. "We are stronger than you," Emma declared, feeling the energy pulse through her. "You have no power here." With one final push, they channeled their strength into the light, a blinding wave that surged forward, engulfing the Shadow Man in its brilliance. The shadows screamed, their form disintegrating into nothingness as the light consumed them. Part 9, Freedom at Last. When the light finally dimmed, Emma found herself alone in the attic, the shadows gone and the air filled with a profound sense of peace. The remnants of Eliza's spirit lingered, a gentle warmth wrapping around Emma like a protective embrace. "Thank you," a soft voice whispered, echoing in the stillness. "You have set me free." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she looked around the attic, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, breaking the curse that had bound Eliza and countless others to Hollow Manor. As she descended the stairs for the last time, the house felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced with a sense of serenity. She stepped out onto the porch, the sun breaking through the clouds, illuminating the path ahead. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. The shadows of Hollow Manor would no longer claim souls, and she had given Eliza a voice, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. With one last look at the manor, Emma knew that she had not only freed Eliza but also herself from the weight of the past. The journey had been terrifying, but it had led her to a deeper understanding of courage and resilience. As she walked away from Hollow Manor, she felt a gentle breeze brush against her cheek, a whisper of gratitude from the house she had freed. She would carry Eliza's story with her, ensuring that the legacy of Hollow Manor would forever be a tale of triumph over darkness. And though the whispers of the past would always linger, Emma knew the truth. she had broken the curse, and the light of hope would shine through the shadows once more.
If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.